Do not be afraid. Stand firm, and you will see the deliverance the Lord will bring you today. The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still. Exodus chapter 14, verses 13 and 14. These liberating words from the book of Exodus are the foundation for Minjung people. Hello everyone, my name is Lindsay Bender, and I will be introducing and discussing Minjung liberative theology. Minjung theology emerged in South Korea during the 1970s. This liberative theology has roots in the historical experiences of the oppressed people of Korea as well as in the stories of the Bible. It's important to understand a brief history of Korea to provide context for the birth and development of Minjung theology. From there, I will discuss theologians and their success in practicing the religion. I will conclude with where they are today and the direction that I am going to take in my paper. Let's dive into a brief history of Korea. Japan forcibly controlled Korea by means of military control, starting in 1905. Korea was deemed a territory of Japan in 1910, thus establishing a military colonial government system. Korean people were forced to participate in emperor worship, which recognized the Japanese emperor as a god. They were also forced to assimilate and become fully Japanese, and acknowledging the people as their masters. Simultaneously, American missionaries entered Korea, bringing with them their faith of Protestant Christianity. These missionaries studied Korean language so that they could communicate with the people and introduce them to their faith. They made efforts to translate the Bible as well to offer it to the oppressed people of Korea. That being said, Minjung theology has roots in Protestant Christianity. The words of liberation and salvation from the Bible inspired the people living under Japanese militant rule. Confucianism and Buddhism are the faiths of the colonization power. Because of this, they are not perceived as liberative, but as aiding to oppression and marginalization. Christianity was used as a powerful liberative message for Korean masses from Chinese and Japanese domination. In its early period, Korean Protestant Christianity participated in people's movements, such as the Independence Club activities, the Righteous Army movement, and the Shinminho movement. Minjung theology recognizes the March 1st independence movement of 1919 as an exodus event for the Korean people. Japanese powers were threatened by Protestant Christian churches, and therefore 47 churches were burned down and hundreds of Christians were killed in demonstrations. Thousands of men and women were subjected to imprisonment and torture. Defeat of Japan in World War II brought liberation for the Korean people. However, this independence was short-lived as Korean people had to endure another experience of oppression. Korea was divided into zones of occupation by the victorious Americans and Soviets. They failed to reach an agreement on a unified Korean government. As a result, two separate governments were established, thus dividing North and South Korea. The territorial division drove North and South Korea to an extreme state of tension, thus leading to the Korean War. In 1953, Korea was left with massive amounts of bloodshed and a country still divided. South Korea went into an intense political turmoil. Despite the huge amount of economic assistance from the US, United Nations, and other Western countries for post-war reconstructions, South Korea was one of the poorest countries in 1953. The economy began to pick up in the 1960s. This was because General Park Chung-hee establishes a military dictatorship in 1961. Despite economic success, political and military marginalization and oppression struck the country. From the 1950s to the 1970s, South Korea witnessed a rapid rise of the J-ball. A J-ball is a large industrial conglomerate that's run and controlled by an owner or family in South Korea. This owner typically has great legal authority. Consequently, there was a huge exploitation of factory workers. The problem of poverty in South Korea was structural. The urban poor were victims of a highly competitive capitalist market. The poor are not just poor because they lack material things, but because of exploitation and injustice in society. The Minjung movement began when Jun Tai-il set himself on fire in November of 1970 in protest against the exploitation of fellow factory workers. This certainly got the attention of outsiders. People of Korea realized this was a serious issue and began to stand with the poor and exploited. In May of 1973, 1 year following the declaration of martial law in South Korea, the term Minjung Theology was officially used for the first time. A group of clergymen and theologians of the Korean Church created and published the Theological Declaration of Korean Christians in 1973. It vividly depicted the life of Christians under a dictatorial regime, outlined the course they should take in resisting injustice and political repression, and confessed the faith which impelled them to struggle for the Korean Minjung. The literal translation of the word Minjung is the common peoples or masses of people. However, the English translation does not do justice for the word. It refers to the people who are politically oppressed, economically deprived, exploited, and therefore poor, socially alienated, and culturally and religiously discriminated against. Minjung theology is a form of protest theology that gives these people a voice that their martial government took from them. Its roots are in historical experiences and the Bible. Minjung theology refers to the Bible as being an account of oppressed people's experience and history. The suffering Korean people resonated most with the stories of the suffering servant and the crucifixion. The Minjung churches relate the suffering of Minjung under Japanese colonialism to the Book of Exodus, where the Israelites are led out of slavery in Egypt. The story of Jesus the Messiah, resurrecting to one day come back to earth, provided hope for the Minjung people, hope for a new age with a bright future. Now that the word is defined and its roots are explained, let's put it into context. Who are the Minjung? In general, an ethnic group is Minjung when it is politically and economically discriminated against by a powerful ruling force. For example, a woman is Minjung when she is dominated by a man, or her family, or by socio-cultural factors. Workers and farmers are Minjung when they are exploited, whether they realize it or not. This is because their needs and basic human rights are ignored and disregarded by the ruling powers. Finally, we will briefly touch on some of the monumental theologians that helped build the foundation of Minjung theology. Theologians use the Minjung socio-economic political events in the Bible, church history, and Korean history as their references. Minjung theologians are leaders among the oppression. While I won't even begin to try to pronounce these names, I listed some of the key people who led the first generation Minjung theology. They provided the framework for later development of the democratic movement in the 1980s. This second generation Minjung theology attempted to overcome limitations of the previous generation. I will go more into depth on the second generation, continuing on until present day Minjung when I write my paper. For now, I hope this presentation gave you a general grasp on Minjung theology. I found it shocking that while in the West we're living in a democracy, free to speak, vote, worship, and so on, Korean people were being forced to assimilate in nearly every aspect of their culture. Learning about this sort of thing opens your eyes to the freedoms we have as Americans and that we definitely take for granted. I hope you feel the same way. Thanks for watching.